the swag on. Get the swag on.
I'm a massive fan of the things that Frog Design does, and it's a good setup to what I'm going to be talking about because it's all about a different way of thinking about the kinds of things that we do. But before I start talking too much about what we do, I want to make sure I know who exactly is here. How many of you are developers or software engineers? Anything similar to that? Okay, a few of you. Designers? Interesting. How about the rest of you? Who didn't raise their hand? Just do it so you'll feel better. There we go, okay, good. No, really, if you don't fall into one of those basic camps that we tend to identify with, what do you do? Just shout out a few things. Shout. Entrepreneur. Okay, how many of you identify with that? If you're in charge of the startup. Okay, cool, that's the rest of you. What I want to talk about then is, because we're all involved in technology in some point, right? At some level. Either you work for a startup or you run a startup, I'm guessing. Yep. Anyone here work for an agency, out of curiosity? A couple of people? Okay. I want to talk about like how we approach creating products. And my definition of product might be different from yours. But what I want to propose is that we need to change the way we think a little bit about how we build things for other people, how we make things for other people. So to do that first, we need to speak a little bit about design itself. It's a really hard thing to define. A lot of people have different opinions of it. I'm using a capital D there because I think of design as a much bigger, broader topic than it tends to be defined as. I've seen far too many startups and established companies as well treat design as if it's some sort of layer that you stick on top of other things, whether that's visual design layer or just something about how, maybe even if it's industrial design, it's how it looks, and that sits on top of engineering or other things, rather than being part of the entire development process. What I think is that how we each and how our teams and organizations define design in particular has a direct effect on the kind of thinking that goes into building the things that we build, whatever it is. For those teams that consider design a layer and a separate thing, we tend to get a lot of engineering heavy and technology heavy companies and products and services. We'll get into the differences between products and services in a little bit. As opposed to the companies that build everything where their thought process is all about design being something bigger, something greater, something that connects all of those intricate parts. So I'm going to try and convince you, if you aren't convinced already, that design is not a layer and shouldn't be a layer, should be involved from the very beginning in everything that we do. It's not just how something looks and feels, it's how it sounds, it's how it behaves, it's how it works and functions and speaks even. To me, design is the entire process. So that includes all of these things we're used to, the thinking, engineering, look and feel, functionality, how all of that comes together to create something, whether that's something brand new or taking something that exists and making it better. Now, this isn't something I've come up with. This is something that I think are two very different types of, again, companies and organizations and people who think in two very different ways about this, and we see the difference in their output. One of my favorite quotes about this is pretty much sums it all up. There are some people, I don't know if any of them are in this room, but some people get tired of hearing references to Apple or to Steve Jobs. Those people get tired of it because they hear it all the time because there aren't very many excellent examples of the thought process. Not everything they make is perfect. I speak at a lot of different events on a number of different design and UX and UI related topics. And so sometimes I try to bring in examples like Disney and the original incarnation of Polaroid. And there are lots of other companies actually that you can point to that tend to stand out as innovators, like proper innovators, where they actually change entire markets rather than just introducing something that improves on what everyone has. So there are other companies we can point to, but Steve summed it up really nicely here. Design is how something works. So the title of this talk is Product Design. This is something I've pretty much put together for you guys tonight based on a lot of other things that I've been speaking about recently. But we tend to think about product design, especially when what we do is mostly software related. Most of us think about products as physical things. We think about cars or cameras, or even a pencil. Something that we can reach out and touch is what we tend to think about when we think product, or especially product design. Well, let's look at these for a minute. So 3 completely different types of product, and yet if you abstract the way you think about what goes into creating them and the teams that go into creating them, you end up having a lot of similarities across all of them. They're all made up of various parts. Again, if you abstract what those specific parts actually are, that are remarkably similar. So physical materials, engineering, electronics, visual industrial design, chemistry involved as well. Their teams are also very similar when we abstract what they do, although there's less abstraction required when we start getting into people. Engineers, designers, ops people. Anyone here in operations? I love operations people. The chief operating officer at Moo was my favorite person at the company. There were a lot of amazing people there when I was there, but the COO just understood how everything worked and everything fit together better than anyone else in the company. That's why I love ops people. They're responsible people and they know what's going on. Accountants, marketers, all these people are required to build all 3 of these products in completely different categories. And I think of all of these people as being involved in the creation and the life cycle of any of these types of products. They're all part, for me, of the design team, the product design team. So when you take design away from being a specific type of design, graphic design, visual design, industrial design, and you just talk about it as a word, for me, it's creative problem solving. That's what design is. So if the team is a design team, then that includes the engineers, that includes the founders, that includes everybody. Design is one of the only things that I think we can actually use as a term that does that has that potential to be all-inclusive, as well as in the process itself. So when we turn our attention to software, and some of you may be building hardware as well, but this is especially an issue with software, we need to start thinking of ourselves more as product design teams. We're designing a software product, but it's still a product, and we can build something better when the entire team is working as a team, rather than separating ourselves into different camps. So let's keep looking at some of the similarities, though, here with products. Strategy also is similar across all these wildly different product categories. They have to deal with scaling and fulfillment, marketing, material acquisition, customer service, on and on and on, right? Lots of different things that we also have to do when we're dealing with software or software services as well. And again, the process is similar. Why I'm pointing all of this out, too, is that by now you should be kind of seeing a lot of similarities in what we do when we're building virtual things as well. These aren't that different at all. The process to develop any kind of physical product is very similar to what we do with software products. Concept, ideation, iteration, prototyping, revision, all of these things go into the work that we do when we make something that doesn't physically exist. So let's talk about that for a minute. The difference between physical and virtual, because that's one of the big blocks, I think, that we have in converting the way that we think and the way we approach building virtual things. Because the users, the customers, the people who actually get to do something with what we build, with what we create, are the same no matter what our product type is, whether it's virtual or physical, right? So tell me, what's the difference inherently between this button and this button? As far as we're concerned, nothing. It's something we press. At its base level, the mental model around the interaction is exactly the same. Because we're building things for humans. Doesn't matter really whether it's virtual or physical. Sure, other constraints kind of come into play depending on which side of that line we fall in. But that's just part of the design process, is dealing with whatever your constraints are. If they're physical constraints, you go in one direction. If they're virtual constraints, you go in another. If they're budget constraints, we still have to deal with those things. It doesn't change the people that we're actually building these products for. I'm not going to dive in too far into that, but as one example, because I could stand here for an entire day and give you loads of examples like this, but one example of the kinds of things that product design teams in the physical world think about that we should be thinking about all the time in the virtual world, but don't necessarily translate unless you're thinking in terms of that product being something that's not just physical, or things like affordance. How many of you are familiar with this term? Oh, good. That's a good number of hands. It's not quite a third. It was maybe 25% of you. But this is a good example for me, because if you're an industrial designer and you go to school for industrial design, for building physical things, you learn this right away. You probably learned this before you go to university to study it. You understand what affordance is. Software design teams don't necessarily have that same type of thinking involved. I'm not going to read this next quote out. I'm going to let you read it. Well, unless it would be easier for me to read it. I'll read it. Why not? It's a great quote by Don Norman. The term affordance refers to the perceived and actual properties of the thing, whatever that thing happens to be, this thing, that thing. Primarily those fundamental properties that determine just how that thing could possibly be used. So in physical terms, that means that the affordances of a chair are what tell us that we can sit in it. It's the right size, shape, position, height to fit our bodies in a seated position. It's also what tells us that a tennis ball is meant to be kind of held. Affordances make up the mental models that allow us to interact with the world around us. We're used to certain things happening in the physical world, so we make a lot of decisions all the time without being aware of them. A lot of subconscious thought processes that go into telling us how we're going to do that thing we're about to try to do, how to interact with that thing that we haven't seen before. These translate completely to software design, but we don't think about them a lot, along with a lot of other categories that physical product design teams tend to think about, because we're dealing with virtual things. And we put ourselves as creators, we kind of give ourselves a different mental model to create just because it doesn't physically exist. And I think that's a big problem. And one of the things that I've found with the companies that I've worked with and my own teams are that if you get people thinking in terms of product design and that everyone is part of a product design team, a lot of those preconceptions of what belongs in virtual and doesn't go away, and people start really thinking in terms of the human interaction side of it. A lot of these influences from industrial design and physical product design come back in very naturally. They don't feel anymore like they don't fit just because it's virtual. It's all a terminology game for me, but it makes a huge difference in how we approach what we build. Other differences that I think tend to hold us back from doing this well sometimes are, again, language differences. And I know this is English versus French, but these differences tend to exist in our thinking. Quick side note, French, I think, is one of the most bulletproof languages in the world because it doesn't actually have a lot of the pitfalls that English does. It's not open to interpretation. I'd like to say that French is probably the world's only designed language, and I love that. It's got constraints to it. It's got rules that you cannot break by law. You know, that's English would be a better language, I think, if it had those rules. How many of you treat these, product and a service, as different things when it comes to technology? Don't be shy. It's okay. There's not a wrong answer. I'm not going to. Okay. How many of you think of these things as very different? Raise your hands if you actually think. That's fine. Or if your teams think that way, because it might not be you. It might be people you work with. How do you define a product versus a service? Because a lot of people think of them as very different things. We have these two words in our vocabulary, and we define them differently because in the physical world, they actually tend to be quite different. Like this is one of those areas where the virtual world makes these things very, very similar, almost the same thing. I'd like to say they are the same thing. So let's just get a couple of suggestions if you're bold enough already. I know drinks haven't been served yet, so you might not have the courage yet, but just get a definition of what is a product versus a service. Anyone? No? So a product is something you buy one time, a service is something you pay for maybe on a recurring basis. How many of you would agree with that? In the way that you normally think, how you relate to it. A couple of hands going up. Anyone else? One more? The questions that I would ask you to think about, to consider in this, is a product only something physical? Can it be virtual, but it has to be something you use? Is a product something you buy once versus recurring? Is a service something that you only use on a recurring basis, or only that you pay for on a regular basis? How do you exactly draw those lines in the virtual world, and when we're talking about software? Really, I think it becomes a whole lot harder when we're trying to think about how to build it, how to approach the creation of these things. I don't think there should actually be a difference. I think for those of us who are making something, it's just a product. The difference there that's more important is how the customers, how the users will relate to it. That's, I think, a useful definition, but not for us who are building it. You're not building a product or a service, you're building a product. The users might be, the sales model might be service related, might be recurring billing, might be subscription based. All those definitions become much more important when we're trying to define how people will interact with the brand, interact with the product itself. People tend to have a lot of preconceptions about what a service is. Maybe the service industry, for instance, is other people doing things for you versus you doing something. We tend to think about product in those terms as being something we use. This is a product, and it's not just a product because I hold it, it's a product because it does something. It allows me to move my slides back and forth. Photoshop is a product, right? We have these ways of thinking about it, but as far as the design team and the design process is concerned, creating something, I think it's all the same. And I think we build better services for customers when we treat that service that we're building as a product. We're selling it as a service, but it is a product. That's something at least that I'd like you to think about, planting that idea, that even when we're building a product, we're a service, it's a product. And the reason I think that is because in order for this design-centric way of thinking to work, where the idea of design, not just as a visual thing, but as creative ways to solve all our problems, to make things phenomenal, to make the world better in whatever way that we can for what we're building, it requires everyone realizing that we need to think in one way for our entire team. That everyone from the CEO to the accountants to the marketers to the engineers to the ops people need to be completely pulling in the same direction. Quick examples then. Dropbox is a service, right? But it's a product. They build a thing, right? The way we interact with it is as a service, but they're building a product. That product is Dropbox. One of their other products now is Mailbox. They build products. They sell it as a service, though. Pages that Apple makes. We would probably identify with that as a product because we pay for it once. But as far as how they create it, there's no real difference in the core way of thinking. To create a great product is to create a great service. Facebook, same thing. That's a product as well. It falls into all sorts of different categories that make it really hard to define as clearly as those other two. Do we think about Facebook as a service or as a product we use? We don't pay for it. Are we the product? Yeah, there we go. Well, so those lines become very blurry. Inconsistencies in how we define the things we're trying to create make it harder to create great things. So when you start thinking about designing software as product design, it's important just to abstract the word product from the old product and service definition. That's still important, but we're using it in a different way. Much like I'm using design in a different way, in a bigger way. Product in this case is not in the consumer definition, it's the thing that we're building. So getting back to the people then, because the whole idea here is that we can build better things if we can change the way that we think about the entire process. And for me, that the main thing that I see and have seen for a long, long time going wrong is that we draw these lines between the parts of our teams that do different things. And sometimes that's okay. You know, we do have engineers and developers, and we do have the design teams. But if there's too much of that definition, if the walls between those teams get built too tall and are too strong, then it prevents us from actually working as one team. And I always encourage the teams that I build are all one team. The teams that I admire, that friends of mine have worked on, that work really well, work as one team. They define their individual roles and responsibilities, but they don't separate the work that they do within that team. So a couple of direct examples from my time at Moo. How many of you have used Moo? Okay, I expect to get business cards from all of you. So one of the things, Moo is a fantastic company. They are consistently like top or really high on the list in London of companies people most want to work for and most enjoy working at, and really great workplace. Everyone's really friendly. It's a fantastic place to be. Everyone there is happy. However, in the time I was there, and I heard about things happening prior to when I joined, and also since I left, that they were dealing with massive issues of scale when it came to the team. How to keep the things that made them great at the beginning, how to hold on to those as their team grew. They've grown really, really quickly. They've been around, Moo's been around for 8 years now, maybe 8.5. And they started as one person, and now they're well over 200 in 2 different countries and 3 cities, I think. The biggest thing that was really clear within the company, and this is, again, a great work environment. However, there was a lot of separation between teams. All Moo created was one thing, one storefront, right? Lots of products, physical products that you can buy and design from Moo, but Moo's focus is on one thing, is on allowing you to get printed things out of them. Everyone in the company has different responsibilities, but they should all be pulling in the same direction. And what happened was, though, as they started to grow and more roles became required, when it changed from having a small team of just a handful of people working around one desk to needing separate desks and a separate floor for your development team, and other changes like that, you ended up having barriers that weren't necessarily built on purpose, but barriers were created between parts of the team that really needed to be talking together all the time, because there wasn't this overarching thought process of this being one team building one product together with different responsibilities. So one example of that was people on the UX team, for instance. I had one instance where the UI designer on my team created a wireframe because we were in a meeting and he made a wireframe as we were talking about it, and and he sent that to the UX people. And the UX team got really upset because the wireframes were the UX team's responsibility. And it wasn't because they were actually upset or because it was a bad wireframe or anything like that. It was that in the process of growing as a company, the teams had grown based on job definition and job description. And people got very, very defensive about that because there wasn't any other ethos to follow. There wasn't any other grand way of thinking within the company. Everyone was always thinking about the brand, about the voice, about how we speak to our customers, but never about how we work together. So people drifted apart. Instead of there being a UX person who was part of the engineering team and sat together, there was then a UX team, and now they sat apart. The creative team sat in the creative area. The engineering team ended up on a different floor. And that physical separation led to thought process separation, which led to conflicts between those separate teams. We weren't separate teams, we were all Moo's team. And it was really interesting for me to see this happen. More examples. Developers were the only ones who were allowed to write code. We had some designers on the team who could do front-end development, but they weren't allowed to, because that's how the process had evolved. It didn't become that way because someone said we need to keep the designers away from our code. It became that way because as the engineering team grew, as the development team grew, they just came up with their rules about doing things, and their rules were different than the rules across the rest of the company. This happens a lot when small companies scale without thinking about that scaling, without thinking about how are we going to keep everyone on the same page. I've seen this happen at companies that I've consulted with as well, who started out, I've worked with a lot of startups, especially in the States and more especially in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And they start really small, and then they get some funding, and then they start hiring, and they go bigger and bigger. And it's one of the interesting things. When you're 3 or 4 people sitting around a table, how many of you are in that kind of situation? Really small team. Only a couple of you? All right. You all talk to each other. You have your own responsibilities, your own area of responsibility, but you talk to each other. Because of the physical proximity. It's not something we have to think about. Integrating our thought process is something that happens organically because we're there, we're physically there. I'm sitting across from you, or you're behind me, and so you can look over my shoulder and see what I'm doing, or I can just go, hey, what do you think about this? It just happens because we're all there. That can stay successful up to a point, but when you get big enough that the physical distance starts to override how we might organically have done something before, we can't help but have those walls built unless we're purposefully looking out for them, unless we're intentionally trying to make sure that they don't form. They will build on their own. We kind of build our own cliques. We group naturally into smaller groups and groups of people who do things more similarly. Once we have, the development team at Moo was 40 people when I was there. It's larger now. 40 people. And split into 4 different teams in that group of 40. The design team, the creative team, included graphic design, UI design, physical product design and packaging, and everything was in one team, and we had 8. We were a really tight-knit team. The development team was a really tight-knit team in subgroups of tight-knit teams. But we barely talked to each other because all of the conversations ended up going on between the creative director and the CTO or the team leads or anyone else. No one on the teams ever talked to each other anymore because the processes had just kind of grown apart. And it wasn't intentional because I asked over and over and over again and tried to change those things while I was there. So it's important, especially for those of you who are in startups and early stage startups, to remember that things will change when you grow, but you can manage that based on the way that you think. So when you're small, if we encourage that way of thinking, that we are all building the same product, that way of defining what we do, of defining it as product design, that everyone's involved, it ends up being a glue that binds everyone together as long as it's continually talked about and discussed at every stage. As you grow, everyone continues to think that way. People don't let those barriers build up because you've been encouraging that from before those barriers were likely to exist naturally on their own. Where this works the best is in small teams. However, big companies, large organizations, can also work with that same approach. And this is connected with that thinking of product design as something we all do, and design running as a thought process and as a binding term connecting everything that we do. But it's also, this next couple of examples is to show you how that can spread, I think, into other ways of operating as teams. The larger the group in general, the easier it is to excuse ourselves from communicating. Well, he's upstairs. I'll talk to him later, or I'll send him an email. When you're around each other physically, you will actually talk to each other, and this is so another thing that I saw at Moo, which was interesting because I've always been in very small teams. Worked with lots of large teams, but purposely kept the teams that I've created and run very, very small. And right away at Moo, I would have people who are sitting as far away from me as you're sitting right now, sending me emails when they were sitting there, rather than getting up from their desk and just coming over, because maybe we were facing in different directions, right? So they weren't going to shout, but they didn't just walk over and say. One time, I actually had someone from marketing, the marketing team was right there. I had someone from marketing who had sent me an email that I hadn't seen because I'd been in meetings all day and just hadn't checked email yet, saw me at my desk because I'd just gotten back there. They walked over to me and didn't ask me the question that they'd emailed me about. They asked me if I'd seen the email because they really needed a response. It had gotten to the point where that inconsequential separation, because of the size of everything, that everything had grown to. Just to give you an example, in the time I was there and in the year I was there, the company doubled in size. In the less than 12 months that I was there, prior to when I was there, it doubled in size. In the time since I've left, it's almost doubled in size again. Like, it's drastic growth, right? So these things just happened. But it resulted in weird things like that because people were able to excuse the fact they didn't communicate. Well, email is how the whole company communicates, so that's how we do it. That was their first thought. It wasn't practical. It ended up with certain people like me and folks on the exec team didn't get a chance to check their email usually until they had got a little bit of time in the morning because we would get to our desks before everyone else did, and then a couple of hours at night after working hours. And during the day, we were all doing other things and not looking at email. So that was actually a very poor way to communicate with some of us, at least. My designers weren't checking their email, they were designing things. That was actually one of our rules in the creative team, was we wouldn't email each other, we just talked to each other. We were a small team, but I made that a rule because it was happening when I got there. So a couple of quick examples then. Big Spaceship, have any of you heard of them? Yeah, fantastic agency from Brooklyn. They've worked on things that include like StarWars.com and Mattel and Barbie and Crayola and massive projects. A really good friend of mine, Dan Mall, used to work there before starting his own agency. And one of the really neat things about Big Spaceship, they're not a massive company, they're a medium to large size agency. I think they're probably in triple digits now. But the teams are assigned projects, and those teams include all the people they need in order to build and design and create the things that they're making. Those teams are actually really small. They have teams of about 6 people on average. Every team includes a design director, a developer, actual like UI and UX designer, copywriter. Like, they have everything that they need in those teams, with exceptions obviously, but they have everything they need to make the thing. They even deal directly with the clients. So all the client interaction is managed by that team. There's no kind of separation and layers of bureaucracy built up in the company or between in each of those teams. They're completely in control of what they're doing, which gives them a load of responsibility, right? But that means that they're less likely to fail because they know that the team is relying on itself to make the things. But they also know that they can rely on any of the other teams if they need help. If they need a few more hands one day to do some part of that project, then it becomes a company-wide thing. So the company's always talking to each other. They manage to, again, have very small, nimble, startup-like teams and yet be a big agency. So they get both of those benefits. All the resources of a big company, all the communication and the talent that comes with that of having really small teams. One of the great things is that also the way they sit. They all sit facing each other. So one table and half the team is on that side, half the team is on the other side. So they're not back to back, they're facing each other. So if you want to look up from your keyboard and actually say something, you can do that. They've built their team structure and their physical structure to facilitate all that communication and that cross-disciplinary communication. Apple works the same way. So again, I've had a number of friends who work or have worked at Apple, and I don't know if you know this, but their product teams are product teams. A really good friend of mine used to work on the iWork team. So that was pre-iPad, pre-iPhone, pre-iPad version. She was the person in charge of doing the calculus for anything that needed calculus in those apps, whether it was Keynote or Numbers or Pages. That was her role on the team. She had other roles too. She was really good at HCI, and she had a broad skill set in interaction design prior to joining Apple. But they had an icon designer. They had developers. The team was fewer than 10 people, I think, at the time that she was working there, and I knew about this, that made all those apps. Well, what happened when the iPad came out? a year before the iPad was announced and released, the team members got called into Steve's office, got handed a prototype, and got told they had a year to build all their software for that. Not grow their team, not add some extra developers to deal with the extra load. Same team, same responsibilities. Here's your thing, do it. You already do it over here, just build these other versions and go. So they always worked. That one little small team worked like a small startup. They never had those problems of scale because part of the mentality that goes into how teams were built at Apple, and I'd like to think it's still that way, post-Steve, is that these smaller teams facilitate more communication and there's more responsibility and ownership taken by everyone on them. Massive company, loads of resources, but lots of very small teams building things. At one point I'd heard, and I don't know if this is exactly true, that the team that built OS X and built and maintained it was maybe 24 people. It was a really small team of designers and developers compared to roughly in the kind of 1,400 or more range of the team at Microsoft that builds Windows in those same roles. So you see massive differences in how teams of those two different sizes will be able to function on building the same kind of thing. It seems kind of ludicrous to think of something that's on the scale of OS X or iOS being built by just a small number of people, but I think there are a lot of benefits from it. And we see that in small startups all the time. Small startups work really, really effectively and really efficiently, can be very nimble, move very quickly. Anyone use Lanyard? It's a web-based thing for, okay, 2 or 3 people. My friends who were in London, now in San Francisco, built Lanyard. It's a service for following, mapping, tracking, and participating in events. Conferences show up there, and you can see who's attending, who's speaking, all these different things. It does one thing really, really well. The number of stories that I heard from them, and they haven't grown very large. They were acquired by Eventbrite, and they still have stayed really small because they decided one day that they were going to add support for multiple languages and just started doing it because they didn't have to go through any kind of approval process. The founders were, half the people around the table. We hear stories of small startups doing that all the time. How often do we hear about big companies being able to pivot really quickly? It can be very difficult. But if you can structure a large company, or especially if you start small and as you scale, you keep that in mind. You keep that small way of thinking, that small structure, even as you add people. It allows you to stay more nimble. It requires giving responsibility to all of those small teams, which can be scary for some people. But that's what it enables. And the final thing that ties all of this back into thinking about being product designers and thinking about that whole team being a product design team is that when teams are small and when they all are thinking and focused on the same thing, everyone gets involved from the very beginning. This is something that when we start to define very separate teams and separate roles, like the designers are over here and the engineers are over here and the marketing team is over here, sometimes you have, I think actually more than sometimes, very frequently you have meetings where not everyone is represented. Not every team is represented. And this is a problem because that's how you get people out of sync with each other. And it's not just a matter of including the people at the top of those teams, because not all of that information gets communicated down. The more you can have an all hands, the better. But if you've got this massive team, having all hands all the time for every decision becomes difficult. But if you involve as many people as possible, the same way as you would be if you were 4 or 5 or 6 people sitting around a table, that everyone involved understands and knows what's being thought about, suggested, decided on, you get more buy-in and more ownership from everyone on the team. How do you apply that kind of way of thinking when you're bringing people on, I guess? Now, this was something that, again, a great example from Moo, very friendly company. Everyone is really fun to work with on the whole. We interviewed a lot, we went through a lot of CVs, but to me it was most important that if someone was going to join that team, that when we met them and spoke to them, it was like they were already part of the team. What was most important to me was the personality of those people. Some of you may work the same way with your hiring, but I cared far less about the exact details of what was in their portfolio or anything else that they had done. I wanted to sit across from them and chat with them and know whether this was someone who was instantly going to fit and understand what it was we were trying to do, which is a very vague thing. And it's not something I could write in the job descriptions. And I had a lot of long, difficult discussions with HR about that because they got frustrated that we weren't hiring people. And they said, well, we're sending you hundreds of people. And I said, and none of them are the right kind of people for us. I don't want to sit there and I don't mind training someone and letting them learn on the job as long as that's all I have to do with them. And they're always contributing. They're not a drain on the team. Somewhat, you've probably all had this experience. I hope you've all had this experience, because otherwise maybe you're the problem. If someone comes and asks for your help and is really eager and positive, you're probably willing to give it right away. Right? And yet there are also those kinds of people that they're asking for your help just because they're lazy, and you know the differences in those people. They tend to be personality types, not one person flipping between those 2 points on the dial. Some people just ask for help because they're not bothered, they can't be bothered to do it themselves or to learn themselves. Other people ask for help because they don't want to have to ask for help the next time. Those are the kind of people that you need to bring on your team for all sorts of reasons, but they're the self-starters. They're the people who, if they weren't working for someone else, would be an entrepreneur themselves. They're going to come up with the ideas that help you build your team. They're going to contribute in all sorts of ways that you can't anticipate, and it's all to do with that personality. Because you're there, that shows that someone in the organization knows that it's needed. So you know that. That is a positive. What you look for is all the positives, and you try to work within those positives as much as you can. And the picture just came into my mind of a prisoner trapped in some dungeon, and all they have is a spoon, and they're just going to keep digging away at that tiny little hole they've made until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. That's the... It just popped into my head that way. That's the way to approach that, though. You find as many of the positives as you can, and that includes the people who understand why you're there. And because if they understand why you're there, they understand that they don't know what you know, and that they need your help. Work with those people as much as possible. Work with all of those little positives that you can to build more and more room for you to do more things. And as you do that, you'll build up trust as well. It's not a given. You might find that there's a threshold, and you get to a point where you don't feel you can actually grow anymore there, and then you leave. But it doesn't mean, just because you're the one person and an intern at that, don't think about being outnumbered like that. You're there because someone there knows they need you. Start there and just continue to dig away at that. The question was, how do you apply this way of thinking to a global organization? I mean, Moo was global in that way. We had 2 offices, but there were struggles that came from being on the east coast of the U.S. and on London time, on GMT. Being 5 hours apart was kind of difficult in an 8-hour day. I think that a lot of the core problems with being distributed like that as a team are very similar to being distributed across 2 different floors in the same building, or 2 different buildings on the same campus. If you're not right next to someone, if it requires a phone call or a Skype chat or anything like that in order to communicate with them, time zones are a very tiny difficulty by comparison to that, because you can have those same problems with time zones not being an issue. It's more about communication and how you communicate. An example of that directly from Moo first is the customer service teams. A lot of people think that Moo is a US founded company because of their excessive focus on customer service, because that seems to be that's a very United States based way of thinking. And it's not. It was founded by Richard from London, who just understood that this was something that all his competitors weren't doing, so he would do it. The customer service, though, had to be, that team was coordinated from the UK, but it needed to be very, very tightly integrated, because if maybe someone someone in the UK starts a conversation with a customer, but someone in the US is going to finish that communication. And that's not just something you solve with software. That's something that you have to solve with the people understanding what they're doing and knowing to talk to each other, and that's basically what happened. Was the rules were that they weren't relying, customer service didn't rely on software to do their job. The customer service team at Moo is fantastic because they treat the customers like people. They're given permission to do whatever they have to do to make the customer happy. They don't need to like get approval to give a free order or to send replacement cards if something went wrong or anything like that. They have that authority themselves. And when they're going to hand something over to someone else, even if it's in the same team, because maybe I'm not coming in tomorrow, and just in case this customer comes back, there's communication between the two people in the CS team who are going to handle that. And CS is Moo's biggest team across 2 countries now and multiple locations even in the UK now because they've grown. Then if you look at companies like Apple again, a lot of Apple's teams are get around that by being small and not spreading the teams across countries. And because they're small, they're not spread across buildings. They're not spread across floors a lot of the time as well. The biggest answer to it, I guess, is don't let the teams get so large that they're going to just be spread out in general. Figure out how to keep that communication feeling as small as possible. A good friend of mine worked in the UK for Apple before moving to Cupertino, and what happened was that there was constant communication. That's the only way that he was allowed to do that. He had to be in the UK for a year waiting for his visa to be able to work there. He's from the Netherlands. And it meant that he had to work some weird hours sometimes, but he was okay with that because it meant he was talking with his team. He wasn't just typing with them. They were speaking to each other, even if it was just like having the speakerphone on or being in constant communication. Again, they, as much as possible, don't rely on technology, especially things that don't allow either face-to-face or voice communication. Don't allow those things to become crutches because they actually get in the way of understanding each other and of communicating things like feel and everything else. I mean, it's really hard to underscore how important it is to just talk to each other. You can't solve everything like that. You are going to have some issues when your time zones are different, and especially when they become drastically different. I had a client in India about 2007. It was a big newspaper, a new newspaper that was starting up, Mint. It was basically their financial paper, and they were 12 hours different from the East Coast, actually 11 and a half hours different, which was a real pain to be trying to work as closely as possible with this client, but always be on kind of exact opposite time zones. What we did was we got on the phone as much as possible, and that meant me being on conference calls at midnight, but to make sure that we were just talking all the time. And it wasn't perfect. I would have so much rather just been there, and they just didn't want to pay for that, for our team to be on site. But it helped because it wasn't just them getting an email and everything was dark or anything. We could have conversations. All those calls were they weren't review calls. They weren't, okay, and now we've got this agenda and we're going to go through all this stuff. They were friendly calls. So we could just chat about whatever happened to come up and meander the same way as we would if we were going out to drinks or having lunch, because that was kind of the glue. And then the rest of the communication that all had to be by email or on Basecamp or whatever else it was back then went easier because we were all communicating with people and we understood the personalities, and you could joke even across language barriers because you were talking to each other casually on a regular enough basis. So yeah, just things like that. Keep the relationship as human as possible, and that helps. Thanks.